In 1951, aircraft carriers were death traps. Pilots weren't dying in battle. They were dying coming home. Crashes, fires, explosions, all because of a single design flaw no one dared to question. And then, one man, a quiet British officer with no engineering degree, drew a single crooked line on paper. That line would go on to save tens of thousands of lives and change naval aviation forever. Watch this video until the end, because by the time you do, you'll understand how one simple sketch rewrote the future of war. November 16, 1951. A pale morning mist drifts across Portsmouth Harbor as Captain Dennis Campbell steps onto the gangway of HMS Illustrious. In his hand, a briefcase, and inside it, just one sheet of paper. On that page lies a sketch so plain, so unassuming, that it looks like a child's doodle. A flight deck slanted 10 degrees to the left. Nothing about it screams revolution. Yet this single drawing will, within 2 years, save more pilots than any new weapon, any armor, or any aircraft ever could. Campbell doesn't know that yet. What he does know, and what keeps him awake at night, is that naval aviation is killing its own men. In the last 12 months alone, the Royal Navy has lost 43 aircraft to landing accidents, 17 pilots dead, dozens more crippled. Every tragedy occurring in the same final half-minute of flight. The moment when a 30-ton jet, racing at 140 miles per hour, tries to hook a wire on a violently pitching ship. One mistake, one missed wire, and the next stop is a steel barricade designed to catch failures, but often acts as a guillotine. Across the Atlantic, the U.S. Navy faces the same nightmare on a grander scale. 776 catastrophic incidents in 1 year. More than 2 a day, and not during wartime, but peace. The Korean conflict only multiplies the horror. The carrier USS Boxer reports 7 crashes in a single deployment. USS Princeton, 9 in just 4 weeks. On straight-deck carriers, one missed arrestor wire means one fate. A fiery collision into parked aircraft, fuel trucks, and ammunition carts. The age of jets had arrived, but carrier aviation was still trapped in the age of propellers. The F-9F Panther touched down 40 knots faster than the old Hellcats, and its engines took 7 long seconds to spool from idle to thrust, an eternity when you're dropping toward the sea at 20 feet per second. Landing signal officers waved frantically, their paddles cutting the air like warnings from fate itself. But by the time a pilot saw he was too high, too low, or too fast, it was already over. Every admiral, every test pilot, every engineer knew the truth. Naval aviation had reached a breaking point. Jets were the future, yes. But the future meant nothing if the present kept killing its pilots. And standing there that cold morning in Portsmouth, Campbell had no idea that his little sketch, dismissed by many as madness, would soon become the quiet revolution that changed everything. The crisis didn't begin in 1951. Its roots stretch back to 1945, when Lieutenant Commander William P. Roan made the first ever jet landing aboard the USS Wake Island. His FR-1 Fireball hit the deck at 90 knots, 20 knots faster than any piston fighter before it. The arresting cables screamed as they absorbed the kinetic shock, but the landing was a success. Everyone applauded. No one truly listened. 5 years later, every navy in the world was facing the same disaster waiting to happen. Jet engines had changed the game, faster, higher, more powerful, but their sluggish throttle response created a deadly trap. On prop-driven planes, pilots could chop the throttle on command and simply drop onto the deck. If something went wrong, they could instantly add power and climb out. Jets couldn't. Once committed to landing, they had to keep the throttle up, power on landings, because if they needed to abort, their engines were too slow to respond. That small difference turned the flight deck into a death sentence. Pilots were now flying the final seconds of approach with their engines roaring, fully committed, knowing that if they missed the arresting wires, they couldn't climb fast enough to escape the steel wall waiting 60 feet ahead. The Americans built stronger barriers. The British experimented with rubberized flex decks. The French tried to lighten their aircraft. Millions were spent. None of it mattered. The crashes continued. Flames consumed jets and pilots alike. Lieutenant Commander Eric Brown, the Royal Navy's chief test pilot, described landing on the flex deck as theoretically sound in his official report, and utterly terrifying to his friends. The U.S. Navy invested $3.2 million in the Davis Barrier, a mechanical net that could supposedly stop a 25,000-pound aircraft at full power. When it worked, it was a spectacle of engineering. When it failed, it turned the flight deck into a funeral pyre. And so, the world's greatest navies found themselves united by a grim paradox. They could not stop killing their own aviators. Captain William T. Rashure from the U.S. Navy put it bluntly in 1945. Current landing procedures force every aircraft into a 60-foot impact zone with zero margin for error. This is incompatible with jet aircraft performance. Translated: we're trying to land 1950s planes on 1940 ships. Everyone saw the problem. No one saw the solution. The focus was always on stronger nets, safer barriers, or better cables. But no one dared to question the most sacred assumption of all, that the landing area had to be perfectly aligned with the ship's axis. No one, that is, until Dennis Campbell decided to ask the forbidden question: what if it didn't? Dennis Campbell was never meant to change history. Born on November 13, 1907 in Southsea, England, he entered the Royal Navy as a midshipman in 1925. By 1931, he had earned his pilot wings, just early enough to fly fabric-covered biplanes and just late enough to witness the dawn of modern aviation. During the Second World War, Campbell flew Fairey Swordfish torpedo bombers, slow, outdated aircraft that nonetheless crippled the Bismarck. He wasn't a visionary or a celebrity. He was a professional who did his duty, steady and meticulous. His reward, the Distinguished Service Cross. After the war, the Admiralty reassigned him to the Ministry of Supply, a bureaucratic desk job. There, he served as Deputy Naval Representative, managing paperwork between the Navy and aircraft manufacturers. He wasn't an engineer. He didn't design planes. He didn't run experiments. His world was filled with schedules, requisitions, and coordination meetings. But Dennis Campbell had one trait that no technical qualification could teach: he couldn't ignore dead pilots. In 1951, he attended the funeral of Lieutenant Michael Mick Lithgow, a young test pilot killed when his jet struck the barricade on HMS Implacable. Lithgow had been one of Campbell's trainees, just 23 years old. His landing was perfect, his speed ideal. He did everything right, except he floated 6 feet too far. The wires slipped past. The barrier failed. The jet exploded. His wife was 5 months pregnant. Campbell stood in the rain beside the grave and whispered to his deputy, Lieutenant Commander Nick Goodhart, "This is madness. We're killing them with our own equipment. A man can fly flawlessly and still die because 60 feet isn't enough room for error. There has to be another way." Most officers make such vows at funerals. Few act on them. Campbell did. He began reading accident reports late into the night. He interviewed landing signal officers, charted approach paths, and covered his desk in sketches and notes. He wasn't an engineer, so he used what he had: intuition and geometry. Then, on a train ride from Portsmouth to London, the breakthrough arrived. As the countryside flickered past the window, Campbell doodled flight decks in his notebook, trying to imagine how to give pilots a longer, safer approach. If you can't make the deck longer, he thought, make it wider. If you can't make it wider, angle it. And in that simple thought lay the revolution. By canting the landing strip just 10 degrees to port, a missed landing wouldn't end in a barricade or parked aircraft. It would end over open sea. A pilot could throttle up, climb away, and try again. No collision, no explosion. Just sky and a second chance. It was so absurdly simple that it felt almost foolish. Either Campbell had stumbled upon a breakthrough that could change everything, or he had just proposed something that every real engineer already knew was impossible. He was determined to find out which. On August 7, 1951, Captain Dennis Campbell entered a conference room at the Ministry of Supply in London, carrying that same sketch. Around the table sat some of the most senior minds in naval aviation: Louis Boddington, Director of the Naval Air Department at Farnborough, Rear Admiral M.S. Slattery, Chief of Naval Research, Commander James, the Royal Navy's top flight operations officer, and 6 veteran engineers. Campbell placed his briefcase on the table, opened it, and spread out his drawing. A simple outline of an aircraft carrier with a flight deck angled 10 degrees to port. For a moment, there was silence. Then the room erupted. "That's completely illegal," snapped Commander James, his voice low but sharp as a blade. "The International Air Navigation Convention requires all flight operations to be aligned with the ship's axis. What you're suggesting violates a law that's been in place for 15 years. Campbell didn't flinch. He had expected skepticism, but what came next wasn't resistance, it was ridicule. "You want pilots to land sideways?" one engineer asked, half laughing. "Do you understand what happens when a ship rolls 12 degrees in rough seas?" another added. "With your angled deck, they'll be fighting drift the entire way down. The landing area will move beneath them like a sliding floor." "Gentlemen," Campbell began, "I'm not claiming it's perfect. I'm saying it might be—" "Dangerous," interrupted James. "You'll increase the number of crashes, not reduce them." The room fell silent again. Campbell could feel the temperature drop. Years of hierarchy and protocol pressed down like armor. He was, after all, a desk officer proposing to rewrite the laws of carrier aviation. Then Louis Boddington, the quiet civilian engineer who had been listening from the corner, leaned forward. "Show me the math," he said simply. Campbell blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "The math," Boddington repeated. "You claim the drift would be fatal. Fine. Calculate it. Let's say the ship rolls 12 degrees and the deck is angled 8. What's the drift offset over a 30-second approach?" Silence. No one answered. Boddington looked around. "Exactly. We don't know. So, let's find out." He turned to Rear Admiral Slattery. "Sir, we can run a trial. HMS Triumph has a test deck. We'll paint an angled landing line on her existing deck. No construction, no cost. Pilots can perform simulated approaches. If the drift problem is real, we'll see it. If it's theoretical, well, we'll know that too." Slattery narrowed his eyes. "And if pilots start crashing, you'll end your career, and Captain Campbell's right here." "Understood," said Boddington, calm as ever. "But if it works—" He paused. "Then we stop killing pilots who did everything right." Slattery exhaled, then nodded once. "Proceed." And so, without blueprints, without funding, and without permission from higher command, the first test of the angled deck was born. Not from a committee, but from a handful of men willing to paint a white line and challenge decades of doctrine. In September 1951, the Royal Navy quietly began one of the most important experiments in aviation history. No fanfare, no headlines. Just a thin white line painted diagonally across the gray steel deck of HMS Triumph. It wasn't a structural change. Nothing had been rebuilt. It was paint, a line angled 10 degrees off the ship's center line. But for the test pilots flying touch-and-go drills, that white stripe represented something radical. The first angled flight deck in history. For 3 weeks, pilots approached the carrier as usual, following the painted virtual runway. Each time, they pretended that the white outline marked the true edge of the deck. And something unexpected happened. Nothing went wrong. The drift problem that the skeptics had warned about simply didn't exist. The pilots adapted almost immediately. 2 or 3 landings were enough for their instincts to adjust. The approach felt natural, even easier. But the real discovery came from the emotion that followed. Lieutenant Peter Chilton, one of the participating pilots, later wrote in his flight log, "I came in too high, floated past the wires, and for the first time in my career, I wasn't terrified. I simply pushed the throttle forward and climbed away. There was no barricade waiting to kill me, no row of parked aircraft ahead, only clean air and another chance. It felt like I'd been given my life back." In that moment, the psychological burden that had haunted carrier pilots for a decade began to lift. By October 1951, the trials on Triumph were complete. The results were impossible to ignore. No disorientation or loss of control during approach. faster recovery from missed landings, dramatic reduction in pilot stress and fatigue. The data was clear, but it wasn't the numbers that mattered most. It was the relief in the pilots' voices, the quiet disbelief that something so simple could erase so much fear. The only problem now was convincing the rest of the world. Because the carrier that had just proved the concept was British, and the carrier force suffering the worst losses wasn't. It was American, and the U.S. Navy wasn't about to take advice from British officers about how to land on their own ships. That battle was about to begin, September 14, 1951. At the U.S. Naval Air Test Center in Patuxent River, Maryland, 40 American test pilots gather in a briefing room. Their expressions are hard, skeptical. At the front stands Lieutenant Commander Eric Winkle Brown, the Royal Navy's chief test pilot, the man who has landed more aircraft types than anyone else alive. He feels every stare as if it were a crosshair. These are combat-seasoned U.S. Navy aviators, men who have spent their careers perfecting the art of carrier landings. And here comes a British officer to tell them they've been doing it wrong. Brown clears his throat. "Gentlemen," he begins, "in the past year, how many of you have hit the barricade?" 7 hands rise, then 12, then 15. "And how many of you have lost a friend to one?" Every hand goes up. The room falls quiet. Brown opens his briefcase and unfolds a piece of paper. Campbell's sketch. "I'm going to show you something the Royal Navy has been testing," he says. "It's going to sound insane, but I've made 63 landings on it myself. I'm standing here instead of being scraped off a deck because of it. So, I'm asking you to hear me out." He pins the diagram to the wall. An aircraft carrier. A flight deck angled 8 degrees to port. The reaction is instant. "You want us to land sideways?" Someone laughs. "The LSO won't even see the approach properly," another shouts. "What about the island structure? You've shifted the landing zone straight toward it." Brown lets the noise burn out before speaking again. "Every objection you've just made," he says evenly, "we had the same ones. Then we tested it. And here's what we found. When you miss the wires on an angled deck, you don't die. You just throttle up and go around." A murmur ripples through the crowd. Some pilots lean forward. Others fold their arms tighter. Then Commander Harold Buell, leader of VF-84 Squadron, stands up. "Commander Brown," he says, "I've been landing on carriers since 1943. What you're suggesting breaks every principle of naval aviation. You're asking us to throw away doctrine forged through 8 years of war." "I'm asking you," Brown replies, "to stop dying for a design flaw." The room freezes. Brown's tone is calm but unyielding. "You're landing jets on straight decks because that's what you have. Not because it works. Straight decks were built for Corsairs and Hellcats, not Panthers and Banshees. The angled deck doesn't rewrite doctrine. It updates the carrier to match the aircraft." At the back of the room, Rear Admiral Apollo Susek, the U.S. Navy's senior aviator in London, steps forward. "I've witnessed the trials on HMS Triumph," he says firmly. "Commander Brown is correct. The system works. I've already recommended that we test the concept aboard USS Midway." But before anyone can react, another voice cuts in. Rear Admiral Alfred Pride, Chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics. "We're already testing solutions," he says coldly. "The Davis barrier has a 98.7% success rate." Brown turns to him. 98.7% of what? The aircraft that actually hit it? What about the pilots who never make it that far? The ones who ditch in the ocean rather than face the barricade at full power? Your statistics measure equipment success, not human survival. The silence that follows is heavy and electric. Half the pilots nod. The others glare. Finally, Admiral Susek raises his voice. "Enough. We'll run paint trials on USS Midway. If it fails, we bury the idea. If it works, we rebuild a carrier for full-scale implementation. But we will not keep losing pilots without testing a possible fix." Admiral Pride pauses for a long 10 seconds. Then, through clenched teeth, "Midway trials authorized. But if a single man dies because of this British fantasy, the program ends. And so do your careers." Brown closes his briefcase, heart pounding. He's just risked everything for a painted line. What he doesn't know is that within 90 days, that line will prove itself so effective that the USS Antietam will become the world's first true angled deck carrier. Winter, 1951-1952. Aboard the USS Midway, engineers and deck crews work through the night, guided only by spotlights and curiosity. By dawn, a crisp, white stripe runs diagonally across the deck. Just paint, but enough to test a radical British idea. For the first time in U.S. Navy history, pilots line up to attempt landings on an angled runway. The air is tense. The senior officers watch in silence as jet after jet comes in low over the fantail, wheels brushing the edge of the painted line. And to everyone's surprise, it works. No drift, no disorientation. The pilots adapt instantly, just as the British had predicted. The white line on Midway becomes an unspoken promise. If you miss, you live. The success of the trial pushes the Navy further. Within months, engineers transform USS Antietam, CV-36, into the world's first true angled deck carrier. A permanent structural modification, not just paint. Steel replaces chalk. Belief replaces skepticism. January 12, 1953. Off the coast of Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, Lieutenant Commander Harold Buell lines up his F-9F-5 Panther for landing. It's his 43rd carrier landing, but his first on a real angled deck. He doesn't trust it. Every instinct drilled into him since 1943 screams that missing the wires means death. But today, that rule no longer applies. Buell lowers his landing gear, trims the aircraft, and radios in, "Panther ball, 3.2. "Roger, ball," replies the landing signal officer. The approach looks perfect until a sudden crosswind lifts his right wing. He's high, too high. On a straight deck carrier, this would be a wave-off. He'd climb out, burn fuel, and try again. But on an angled deck, the LSO says nothing. The pilot has freedom, room to correct. Buell noses down slightly, trying to settle into the groove. He touches down, hard. The hook skips over the first wire, then the second, third, and fourth. A complete miss. On a straight deck, he would already be tearing into the barricade, his aircraft disintegrating in fire. But this time, the sea stretches ahead. Buell slams the throttle forward. The Panther's engine spools up, slow but steady. 6 seconds later, he's climbing. Alive. 23 seconds after that, he's back in the landing pattern. Second attempt. Perfect alignment. The hook catches the third wire. Touchdown. Buell climbs out of the cockpit, heart pounding. He isn't shaking from fear, but from relief. He would later write, "Landing a jet on an angled deck was sheer bliss. For the first time in my career, I wasn't afraid of dying during every approach." Over the next 60 days, Carrier Air Group 8 completes 1,227 landings on Antietam's new angled deck. 8 bolters, missed wires that require go-arounds, 0 crashes, 0 destroyed aircraft, 0 deaths. The numbers speak louder than any report. Before the angled deck, in 1950-1952, the U.S. Navy averaged 647 major accidents per year, with landing mishaps making up over half of all losses. After its adoption, 1955-1957, that number fell to 321, and fatal barrier crashes dropped by 75%. But beyond the statistics, it was the psychology that changed. Pilots who had lived with the quiet dread of every landing suddenly felt something new: hope. One pilot, Lieutenant James Davidson, proved it best. March 8, 1953. Returning from a mission, his Panther suffers hydraulic failure. No flaps. Landing speed, 20 knots too fast. On a straight deck, he would have ditched at sea. Instead, he makes 4 passes, misses all 4 wires, and on the 5th, catches the last one at 142 knots, stopping with just 11 feet to spare. Months later, he wrote a letter to Campbell. "Sir, I never met you, but I'm alive to write this because of your idea. My daughter was born last month. I got to be there because you refused to accept that good pilots should die for bad design. Thank you doesn't seem enough, but thank you. By mid-1953, word spreads across every navy in the Western world. What started as a sketch in a notebook has become a revolution. By 1954, the revolution that began with a white line on HMS Triumph and a single pilot's sketch had become unstoppable. What started as a British curiosity was now a global shift, one that every navy, whether they admitted it or not, would soon have to follow. The Royal Navy led the charge. The new HMS Ark Royal became the first carrier in the world, built from the keel up with an angled deck, optical landing aid, and steam catapults, a design that blended engineering precision with human survival. The United States Navy, initially skeptical, now moved faster than anyone. They converted multiple carriers, Antietam, Midway, Essex, Forrestal, each one embracing the same 8-degree offset first drawn by Dennis Campbell. The data was irrefutable. The lives saved were visible in every squadron roster. Then came France with the Clemenceau, Australia with HMAS Melbourne, and finally Canada, India, and Brazil, each quietly following the same blueprint. Even the Soviets, who had mocked the concept as Western improvisation, implemented angled decks after a string of fatal crashes aboard the Varyag. When their archives were declassified decades later, they showed that landing accidents dropped 68% in just 6 months. But statistics, again, told only part of the story. The true proof of the revolution lived in the pilot's letters. "Sir, I caught the 4-wire on my second try today. 10 years ago, that would have been my funeral. Instead, I get to go home. The fear's gone, sir. I never realized how heavy it was until it lifted." Hundreds of messages like these reached Campbell's desk. Some were formal military memos, others handwritten notes from grateful aviators, men who, for the first time, could make a mistake and live to tell about it. Across the Western world, naval aviators began speaking a new kind of language, one that included the word bolter, not as a death sentence, but as a routine part of flight. A missed landing no longer meant catastrophe, it meant try again. By 1957, every major carrier operating nation had either converted its decks or ordered new ships with the angled design. The innovation was no longer an experiment, it had become doctrine. And through all of it, Captain Dennis Campbell, the man who sparked the change, stayed out of the spotlight. No interviews, no speeches, no demands for recognition. He was already thinking about what could still go wrong. Dennis Campbell never sought fame, and when it came knocking, he quietly turned it away. While the world's navies celebrated the angled deck as a triumph of engineering, Campbell saw only one thing: a fix to a deadly mistake that should never have existed in the first place. In 1954, he was promoted to Rear Admiral, a quiet acknowledgement of his contribution to naval aviation. When the HMS Ark Royal, the first carrier designed entirely with an angled deck, was launched, reporters crowded around him for statements. He smiled politely and pointed them toward Louis Boddington and the engineers at Farnborough. "They made it possible," he said, and walked away. A year later, the U.S. Navy invited him to the commissioning of the USS Forrestal, the first American supercarrier equipped with every major modern advancement. Angled deck, steam catapults, optical landing system, the complete realization of his vision. Campbell declined. He had a funeral to attend. A Royal Navy lieutenant, one of his former subordinates from 1943, had died in a helicopter training accident. It had nothing to do with carrier landings, nothing to do with Campbell's invention, but he went anyway, because to him, that was the duty that never ended. You attend your people's funerals, always. In 1957, the Admiralty awarded him the CBE, Commander of the Order of the British Empire, for his services to naval aviation. The official citation was just 2 sentences long. Campbell tucked it into a drawer and never spoke of it again. He retired from the Royal Navy in 1960 and joined Hawker Siddeley Aviation as a technical consultant, helping develop early vertical takeoff jets, a new frontier in flight. Colleagues remembered him as relentless, patient, and infuriatingly thorough. Dennis would slow every meeting down, recalled engineer Anthony Marsh. He'd ask, "What happens if this fails at night?" In bad weather? We'd tell him the odds were 1 in 10,000. He'd reply, "Then what does the pilot do when it happens?" He didn't care about probabilities, only possibilities. He never lost sight of the human cost behind the technology. Campbell died on April 6, 2000, at the age of 92. His obituary in the Times was 4 paragraphs. The Guardian gave him 6. Both mentioned the angled deck. Neither captured what it meant. What it meant was this: every safe carrier landing since 1953 traces back to one stubborn man who refused to let good pilots die for bad design. And yet, true to form, Campbell left behind no memoir, no speech, no attempt to claim credit. He believed that the work spoke for itself, and that the only glory worth having was measured in lives saved. By the dawn of the 21st century, the angled deck was so universal that few young aviators even knew carriers had once been flat. The revolution was complete and invisible. Every aircraft carrier in service today, from American supercarriers to French, Indian, Chinese, and Russian fleets, owes its design lineage to that simple sketch drawn in 1951. The Gerald R. Ford-class carriers, with their electromagnetic catapults and digital arresting systems, still carry decks angled exactly 8 degrees to port, just as Campbell drew it on that foggy morning in Portsmouth. Across the U.S. Navy alone, pilots make over 15,000 carrier landings each year. About 8% end in bolters, missed wire approaches that once meant certain death. Without the angled deck, those would be 200 crashes annually, hundreds of lives lost every year, thousands over decades. 70 years later, the true measure of Campbell's legacy isn't written in awards or blueprints. It's written in the quiet, ordinary moments when a pilot misses the wires, slams the throttle forward, climbs away, and lives. In 2003, retired U.S. Marine Corps pilot Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Black, who had flown FA-18 Hornets off carriers from 1985 to 2007, tracked down Campbell's family and sent them a letter. "I never met your father," it read, "but I made 147 carrier landings in my career. I boltered 14 times. 14 times I might have died. Instead, I just climbed, turned, and came back around. Your father gave me 14 second chances. He gave me a career. He gave me a life. On behalf of every carrier pilot who ever lived because of him, thank you." Campbell never saw that letter. He had been gone 3 years. But his son framed it, because his father had never kept any of his medals, only the words of those who survived. Today, every safe carrier recovery, every hook catching the wire, every pilot walking back to the ready room, is a silent tribute to that one man who refused to accept that's how it's always been. Dennis Campbell wasn't a scientist or a genius or a decorated engineer. He was a naval officer who went to too many funerals, asked one forbidden question, and drew one imperfect line on a piece of paper. That line changed naval warfare more than nuclear power or guided missiles ever could. It saved tens of thousands of lives, turned fear into confidence, and transformed the deadliest 30 seconds in aviation into a moment pilots could face with calm precision. Because sometimes, history doesn't belong to the loudest voices or the highest ranks. Sometimes, it belongs to the one person who refuses to let good people die for a bad idea and keeps asking why not.